So now let's go into some of the estimation techniques once you have collected the data. So then the question becomes, what do you do with all these location information that you've collected? So on the left here might be a typical situation if you're using a VHF transmitter where you're going to get maybe one location a day. Whereas on the right, here's information that you could get from a GPS collar, for instance, where you could get potentially dozens of locations or even more per day. So you're going to have thousands of locations overall. Well, we're going to talk about another number of different ways of estimating home range, but there's some considerations that need to go into which approach you're going to use. One is, do you want to be able to estimate what we call the utilization distribution? In other words, the intensity of use of an area by an individual, so that you can get some idea of areas that it's using more often than others. Again, we tend to think high use areas are more important. That may or may not be true, as we've talked about. But it is important in terms of just knowing where animals tend to be most frequently, especially if you're involved in some sort of conservation or management action. So a more contemporary definition of home range is the extent of area with a defined probability of occurrence over a specified time period. So there's really two things now that differ from the original definition by Burt. Is number one, that we're defining a particular time period. So, whether it's the winter period, the breeding period, and so on. And also adding the probability of occurrence to the definition, not just where an animal occurs. There's three important questions that you need to consider when choosing an estimator to use for a particular data set. First is, do we want to know the utilization distribution or not? Most cases these days, that is an important consideration. In other words, how the intensity of use across the home range. Secondly, are we going to assume some underlying shape of the home range? And we'll talk briefly about parametric home range estimators, where you're assuming some distribution or underlying shape. These tend to be not used very much anymore, but they're out there, so we should at least make you aware of them. And those are referred to as parametric home range estimators. Non-parametric do not assume any underlying shape, and those are the ones, as I said, that are mostly used. And then thirdly is, do we have location data that's independent or correlated? And by that we mean, does one location that we obtain tell you any information about another location that you have obtained recently? In other words, if you go out and locate a squirrel at one time and then you go out a minute later and locate him again, obviously those two positions are going to be dependent. In other words, there's only so far a squirrel can move in a minute. And so obviously in that case, these would be dependent information. Many estimators require independent data, and as a result, that has had an influence on how we collect the data. So oftentimes we collect data far enough apart that we know the animal could have moved, say, anywhere within its home range in that period. So in many cases we use a day between collection of data, so that we know, yeah, you could have moved, even 10 miles if you're a bear or something across a home range in that period. So there's no way that the position at that second time would depend on where they were found the day before. That could be shorter time frame for birds, for instance, and other smaller animals. So the definition of independence depends really on the species that you're looking at. So we're going to cover 4 different types of estimators today. And this is a subset of all the ones that are out there, and this is a quickly evolving field, so it wouldn't surprise me if new ones pop up over the next few years. But we'll start with the basic approach, the minimum convex polygon, and then talk about the bivariate normal, kernel, and then the newest approach, the Brownian bridge movement model. So the simplest and oldest approach to estimating home range is what's known as the minimum convex polygon approach. And basically the idea is that you connect the outlying points. There's one stipulation here though, and that is that it's the smallest polygon around points with all interior angles less than 180 degrees. So what do we mean by that? Well, you might be tempted if you were to look at this cloud of points here is to say, well, here's an outlier, but geez, this is area that's not being used by the animal. So let's just draw a point from here to here and then back out to here. Okay. The problem is now that this interior angle that you're creating is going to be greater than 180 degrees. So that's a no-no. You can't do that for the MCP method. What that does is it means that you're going to include some areas that are not used, but that's kind of the penalty for having a standardized definition that is consistent. So the advantages of MCP is that it's simple. It also allows historic comparisons because this is the approach that was used many decades ago before we had more advanced analytical techniques. And so if you want to ask, has there been a change in home range size of a species in an area, this would be the approach that you'd want to compare it to. And it's inclusive. It's going to include all the areas that an animal uses. You're not going to exclude any outlying areas. Disadvantages is that the outliers really influence the estimate of home range. If you have one outlier, that can really cause your home range area to increase greatly. And as we talked about, it's going to include areas that are really not used at all by the animal in many cases. And there's one final thing here is the minimum convex polygon approach assumes that the utilization distribution is uniform. Okay, so you're not indicating any areas of high use and low use. You just get one number, the area of the home range. The next approach that was used that really isn't used much at all anymore, but I'll talk about it because you will see it in the literature, is what's known as the bivariate normal home range estimator. This is what we call a parametric estimator because it makes an assumption about the distribution of the animal across the landscape. And basically what you do here is you say, okay, here's the mean centroid of the locations in 2 dimensions, all right? So we'll just assume that like a normal distribution, we have a mean and a variance around that distribution in 1 dimension. And then we'll use that to define a normal curve, say in the north-south direction here. And we can do the same thing in the east-west direction. And doing that, we can make this curve. And, that can be useful. You can say, okay, where does the animal focus most of its use? Maybe we'll look at the 50% utilization distribution and say, okay, well, it really is spending much more of its time here. And then you can use the 95% utilization distribution. So now we're able to kind of talk about areas that they use more or less than other areas in its home range. But, so you're relaxing that assumption of equal utilization, but the problem is that when you really look at actual use of areas by animals, they don't follow this nice bivariate normal distribution. They're very clumped in a number of different locations oftentimes. Well, the next thing that came along is what's known as a kernel estimator, and this was really developed for other fields as we started to get more spatial data and started thinking about, well, how can you analyze information about space use, across all kinds of things, whether it's humans or animals. And the kernel estimator estimates the utilization distribution based on the assumption that locations are independent. Okay, so again, you have to have data where you don't have two locations within 5 minutes of each other, for instance, or that'll really bias your utilization distribution. And what happens now is you place a kernel over each location. Either a very tight kernel like this one here, small, where you're saying, okay, the use around that location is very limited to just that point and areas very close by. Or you could use what we call a medium kernel, where it's saying, okay, it was here right then, but it's probably using areas further around that, or a large kernel. Okay. And what you do is you put these distributions around each point, and then you sum them all up and standardize it so that the probability sums to 1 for the entire home range. And then you can get a very lumpy home range distribution. The advantage is that it's estimating a utilization distribution. It doesn't have the assumptions of parametric distribution like the estimator we just looked at. The disadvantage is now you have this other parameter H that you have to estimate, and the look of the home range can vary a lot depending on that smoothing parameter that you use. And so this is what changes in the smoothing parameter can do. If you're assuming a small kernel, then each one of these points has a small utilization distribution around it, and you put those together, you get a little hump here, you get a little hump here. Maybe this is going to sum up to something bigger like this. So you're going to have a lot of kind of narrow peaks. When you start increasing the width of the H value, what this will tend to do is combine utilization distributions from adjacent points. So instead of having lots of small or narrow peaks, you're going to have more broad peaks. And we'll see that in the next slide. So say you have a typical set of data where you've got some locations of an animal. If you use very small smoothing factor, you're going to get lots and lots of little peaks. If you use more of a medium one, then those peaks are going to kind of mesh together and become smoother. And then finally, if you use very large smoothing parameter, you're just going to get an overall smooth shape to that distribution. So then the question becomes, what's right? Which smoothing parameter do you use to get your estimate of home range? Because obviously, if you're looking at, say, your 50% utilization, in other words, where the animal spends 50% of its time, you're going to get a very different estimate if you use a narrow smoothing parameter than if you use a wide smoothing parameter. Okay, so important question that has to be addressed, obviously. The kernel estimator works well for the typical kind of VHF data that we collect, 30 to 100 locations per animal. And again, oftentimes the study design is built around the fact that you want independent observation. So you don't go out and locate an animal twice in 10 minutes apart. You animate, locate that animal one day, move on, find your next animal, and so on, maybe through the 10 or 20 animals that you've got out there, and then you come back the next day and find that same animal again, so that you know they could have moved a long distance between locations. But again, you have this problem of what's the proper way of estimating the smoothing parameter. There are some analytical techniques that get pretty involved, and we're not going to get into that, but just suffice it to say that there's been a lot of work involved in identifying what's the appropriate smoothing parameter. With the data that we're collecting now using GPS transmitters, that assumption of temporal independent locations is often cases just not met. Okay, if you're collecting GPS locations every 20 minutes, sometimes you even see people collecting it every 10 minutes now, just because you can. Those locations are obviously not going to be independent of one another. There's just, no way an animal can move very far in 10 minutes, for instance. And it also generates thousands of locations, which then also causes problems for the kernel estimator. So here's a typical example of kernel estimator using VHF versus GPS data sets. Okay. And this is the 95% kernel estimator, so it's where 95% of the activity is focused. And if you use, 83 points, and these are data from black bears that were collected by a grad student here at CSU, and he actually had a GPS transmitter on this bear, so he was able to collect 5,000 plus points. And what he did to get this data set, he said, okay, let's take all of these data and just pull out one location a day, and that'll give me 83 points. They ran it through a program to estimate what's the best value of H to use for those data. Got an H value of 216, and this is the home range plot that it provided. If you feed that same data into the same programs for estimating H, now it brings that down to a much smaller value, and what that results in is a very highly digitized or separated home range, which obviously is going to be much smaller than the home range that you estimate here. This is the same animal, and so that's obviously a real problem in terms of coming up with comparable estimates. So as we talked about, the kernel estimator really has problems with GPS data sets where you have obviously dependent locations, and that leads to computational problems. So for modest data sets that we often get from VHF studies, the kernel home range estimator does a good job, but when you get these huge data sets associated with the GPS collars, the estimators just basically blow up. So in the next lecture, we'll focus on the new approach called the Brownian movement estimator that can deal with these kinds of data sets with lots and lots of data points.